The snow had started falling before sunset. By the time darkness covered the countryside, the world outside the farmhouse had disappeared beneath a cold white blanket. The fields were empty. The roads were quiet. The wind pushed against the walls as if trying to find its way inside. In the kitchen, a mother stood beside a small wooden table illuminated by the trembling glow of a kerosene lamp. She opened the pantry and searched slowly through what remained. There was no sack of flour waiting on the shelf, no smoked ham hanging from the rafters, no basket overflowing with vegetables, just a few odds and ends gathered from days of careful rationing. Then her hand stopped. Resting near the back of the cupboard was a single potato. One potato to feed a family. One potato standing between hunger and supper. To many people today, that might sound impossible. But during the Great Depression, millions of American families faced moments exactly like this. They lived through years when jobs vanished, savings disappeared, and every meal became a challenge that demanded creativity, patience, and determination. Yet somehow, against all odds, families continued to gather around dinner tables. Children still went to bed with something warm in their stomachs. Mothers and grandmothers transformed the simplest ingredients into meals that stretched far beyond what seemed possible. And among all the foods that helped people survive those difficult years, none proved more valuable than the humble potato. A potato was inexpensive, filling, and remarkably versatile. It could become soup, bread, dumplings, pancakes, gravy, casseroles, or stews. It could make a small meal larger, and a large family feel just a little less hungry. In rural communities, families planted potatoes because they produced generous harvests, even in difficult conditions. In cities, they became one of the most affordable foods available. During the worst years of economic hardship, people learned to use every part of them. Nothing was thrown away. The skins were saved. The cooking water was saved. Even the smallest scraps often found their way into another dish. These recipes were not created by famous chefs working in elegant kitchens. They were created by ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances. They came from farmhouses battered by winter storms, from crowded apartments in industrial cities, from mining towns struggling through unemployment, and from communities where neighbors quietly helped one another survive another week. Each recipe carried a story. Each meal represented a small victory over hardship. As we travel back to those difficult years, we are not simply looking at food. We are looking at resilience. We are looking at the ingenuity of people who refused to give up when circumstances seemed impossible. The meals on this list may appear simple, but behind every bowl, every skillet, and every loaf stood families who found ways to endure. Their resourcefulness transformed a single potato into enough food for an entire table. Their determination turned scarcity into sustenance, and their lessons remain surprisingly relevant even today. So settle in as we count down 25 genius Depression-era meals that stretched a single potato into dinner, beginning with a dish so simple that many modern kitchens would throw its main ingredient away without a second thought. Number 25. Potato water gravy. Imagine a pot of potatoes simmering gently on a wood stove. Once the potatoes were cooked, most people today would drain the pot and send the cloudy water straight down the sink. But during the Depression, throwing away something useful was almost unthinkable. That starchy water contained flavor, nutrients, and most importantly, opportunity. Resourceful cooks poured it into a skillet where a little flour had been browned, sometimes with a precious spoonful of bacon grease, if any happened to be available. The result was a thin but flavorful gravy that could be poured over biscuits, cornbread, toast, or sliced potatoes. It wasn't a luxurious meal. It wasn't intended to impress anyone. Yet on cold evenings when food was scarce, potato water gravy transformed what appeared to be waste into nourishment. More importantly, It reflected a philosophy shared by countless families throughout the Depression. If something still had value, no matter how small, it deserved a place at the table. Long before modern conversations about sustainability and reducing waste, struggling Americans practiced those principles because survival demanded it. Every drop mattered. Every crumb mattered. Every potato mattered. Number 24. Fried potato peelings. Most people think of potato skins as something to remove and discard. During prosperous times, many families did exactly that. But when money became scarce and every meal had to stretch as far as possible, people began looking at familiar ingredients differently. A potato peeling was no longer waste. It was food. In kitchens across America, mothers carefully washed potatoes before peeling them, making sure every strip of skin remained clean and usable. The peelings were tossed into a hot cast-iron skillet with a little lard, bacon grease, or whatever cooking fat happened to be available. They crackled and curled as they cooked, filling the room with a rich aroma that made children gather near the stove. Sprinkled with a little salt, they became a surprisingly satisfying side dish or evening snack. Some families later recalled that fried potato peels were so delicious, they sometimes preferred them to the potatoes themselves. What sounds like a desperate measure today often became a cherished memory for those who lived through those years. It was another example of how Depression-era households discovered value in places others never thought to look. A single potato could now provide not only the main meal, but an additional dish as well. The ingenuity behind recipes like these came from necessity, but it also revealed something deeper about the people who created them. Hardship forced families to become extraordinarily observant. They learned to see potential where others saw scraps. They learned to examine every ingredient and ask the same question: what else can this become? That question echoed through countless kitchens during the 1930s. It inspired hundreds of small innovations that rarely appeared in cookbooks, but were passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, mother to daughter, grandmother to grandchild. These recipes were rarely written down because they lived in memory. They were lessons taught beside stoves and kitchen tables, often during some of the most difficult years families would ever face. Number 23. Potato flour cakes. On many mornings, bread supplies ran low, long before families could afford more flour. Wheat prices fluctuated, incomes disappeared, and grocery money often vanished before the week was over. Potatoes offered a solution. By drying and processing potatoes, or simply mixing mashed potatoes into small amounts of flour, cooks could create simple cakes that provided energy and fullness despite using far less grain. These cakes varied from region to region. Some resembled flatbreads, others looked more like thick pancakes. They were cooked on griddles, skillets, or directly on stove surfaces. Served warm, they became breakfast, lunch, or supper, depending on what the family needed. Their taste was mild, but their importance was enormous. Every handful of flour saved meant another meal later in the week. Every substitution bought families precious time until another paycheck arrived, or until work could be found at all. Number 22. Potato and onion skillet. If there is one pairing that appears again and again throughout Depression-era cooking, it is potatoes and onions. Together, they formed the backbone of countless meals because both ingredients were inexpensive, easy to store, and capable of producing surprisingly satisfying flavors. The preparation was simple. Potatoes were sliced thin to maximize volume. Onions were chopped and cooked slowly until they softened and released their sweetness. Everything was fried together in a cast-iron skillet until golden brown. There was no complicated seasoning. There was no expensive meat. Yet when the skillet reached the center of the table, the smell alone could make an empty stomach feel hopeful. For many families, this dish represented an entire supper. Sometimes a slice of bread accompanied it. Sometimes it stood alone. Either way, it offered warmth, comfort, and enough substance to carry people through another day of hard work and uncertainty. The Great Depression was not experienced equally across America. Some families endured temporary hardship while others struggled for years. In farming regions, people often had access to gardens and livestock, but little cash. In cities, food might be available in stores, yet unemployment made purchasing it nearly impossible. Despite these differences, one experience remained remarkably common: uncertainty. People often woke each morning not knowing how they would pay bills, find work, or provide supper. That uncertainty created a constant weight that settled over daily life. Yet amid that uncertainty, the evening meal remained important. It was more than nutrition. It was stability. It was routine. It was a moment when families gathered together and reminded one another that they were facing difficulties as a unit rather than alone. Number 21. Poor man's hash. Few dishes better captured the spirit of Depression cooking than hash. There was no single recipe because the entire purpose of hash was adaptability. Whatever leftovers existed could be combined into something new. Potatoes usually formed the foundation. A small piece of meat from yesterday's supper might be added if available. Bits of onion, cabbage, carrots, or beans often found their way into the skillet. Everything was chopped, mixed together, and fried until crisp around the edges. The beauty of hash was that it transformed scarcity into abundance, or at least the appearance of abundance. Small portions became larger. Leftovers gained a second life. Families who might not have enough ingredients for a traditional meal could still create a skillet full of food capable of feeding several people. Every household made its own version. Every skillet told a slightly different story. Yet all of them reflected the same determination to waste nothing and make the most of what little remained. Number 20. Potato cornmeal cakes. In many parts of America, cornmeal was cheaper and more readily available than wheat flour. When combined with mashed potatoes, it created sturdy cakes that could feed large families at minimal cost. The mixture was shaped by hand and cooked until crisp on the outside while remaining soft within. Some families served them alongside beans. Others ate them with gravy or milk. Children often carried leftovers for lunches the next day. These cakes demonstrated one of the most important principles of Depression cooking: stretching ingredients through combination. A single potato alone might not feed many people, but when combined with cornmeal, it became part of something larger. That philosophy appeared repeatedly in kitchens throughout the decade. People learned that survival rarely depended on a single ingredient. It depended on knowing how to make small things work together. As the years passed, many of these recipes quietly disappeared from everyday life. Economic conditions improved. Supermarkets expanded. Refrigeration became common. New conveniences arrived. Yet the memories remained. Decades later, elderly Americans often spoke about these meals with surprising affection. Not because the years themselves had been easy, they certainly were not, but because the meals represented something greater than food. They reminded people of parents who sacrificed silently, grandparents who shared hard-earned wisdom, and families who endured together when circumstances offered little reason for optimism. The recipes survived because the stories survived, and some of the most ingenious potato meals were still ahead. Number 19. Potato broth soup. On the surface, it seemed almost too simple to be called a meal. A pot filled mostly with water, flavored by potatoes and whatever vegetables happened to be available. Yet in thousands of households, this humble soup carried families through some of the hardest winters they had ever known. The secret was patience. Potatoes simmered slowly for hours, releasing starch that thickened the broth and made it feel far more substantial than its ingredients suggested. If a carrot could be spared, it was added. If a cabbage leaf remained from another meal, it joined the pot. Sometimes an onion provided the only real seasoning. The soup bubbled quietly on wood stoves throughout the afternoon, filling homes with an aroma that suggested abundance even when the pantry shelves told a different story. Children returning from school often remembered that smell decades later. It was the smell of warmth, the smell of home, the smell that meant there would be something waiting for them at supper. What makes Depression-era food so fascinating is that many of these dishes were not designed merely to fill stomachs. They were designed to preserve morale. Hunger affects more than the body. It affects the mind. It creates anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. Families understood this instinctively. A steaming bowl of soup could not solve unemployment. It could not restore lost savings, but it could create a brief sense of security at the end of a difficult day. For an hour or two, people could sit together, share conversation, and forget about tomorrow's worries. That emotional comfort was almost as important as the food itself. Number 18. Potato drop dumplings. There was something almost magical about the way a small amount of potato could multiply into a pot full of dumplings. Cooks mashed potatoes and mixed them with a little flour and whatever seasonings were available. The resulting dough was dropped by spoonfuls into simmering broth, where each small portion expanded as it cooked. What began as a single bowl of ingredients soon became enough dumplings to feed an entire family. Children especially loved them because they felt more substantial than soup alone. Soft, warm, and filling, they transformed a modest meal into something memorable. In many households, dumplings appeared whenever food supplies ran low, because they allowed families to create the illusion of abundance. The pot looked full, the table looked full, and for a little while, that feeling mattered. Number 17. Depression potato patties. Leftover mashed potatoes were never guaranteed during the Great Depression, but when they existed, they rarely went to waste. The next day they became potato patties, mixed with a little flour and perhaps an egg, if the family was fortunate enough to have one. The potatoes were shaped into small cakes and fried until golden brown. The outside developed a crisp crust, while the inside remained soft and comforting. Some families served them with gravy. Others ate them plain. Either way, they represented another principle that guided Depression kitchens. Every meal should create the possibility for another meal tomorrow. Leftovers were not an afterthought. They were part of the plan. Resourceful cooks constantly thought several meals ahead, stretching ingredients across days rather than hours. The remarkable thing about many of these recipes is how little they relied on exact measurements. Modern recipes often demand precision. Depression cooking relied on judgment. A handful of flour, a spoonful of grease, enough water to make the mixture work. People adjusted recipes according to circumstances because circumstances changed constantly. Some weeks brought slightly better supplies. Other weeks brought almost nothing at all. Flexibility became a survival skill. The kitchen functioned less like a laboratory and more like a workshop, where creativity and experience mattered more than strict instructions. Number 16. Potato skillet pie. The word pie usually brings to mind rich fillings and flaky crusts. But Depression-era skillet pies followed different rules. Potatoes formed the foundation, layered into cast-iron pans, with onions, vegetables, and occasionally tiny amounts of meat, if any could be spared. Everything cooked together slowly, until the ingredients blended into a hearty meal that seemed far larger than the sum of its parts. The skillet itself became part of the recipe. Cast iron retained heat efficiently and allowed cooks to prepare satisfying meals while using less fuel, a crucial advantage when firewood, coal, or kerosene were precious commodities. Families gathered around these skillet pies not because they were luxurious, but because they felt substantial. In difficult times, substantial mattered. Number 15. Potato and cabbage mash. Few combinations stretched food supplies more effectively than potatoes and cabbage. Both ingredients could be grown in home gardens. Both stored well through winter. Both provided volume that helped satisfy hungry families. Together they created a dish that appeared across countless American tables. The cabbage softened and blended into the potatoes, increasing the quantity dramatically while maintaining a comforting texture. A family that might have struggled to share a bowl of mashed potatoes alone could suddenly feed everyone at the table. The meal was simple, yet it reflected generations of practical wisdom. Similar combinations appeared not only in America, but throughout Europe as immigrants carried traditional recipes with them. During the Depression, those traditions proved invaluable. As the decade wore on, many Americans developed a deep respect for food that never left them. People who lived through severe scarcity often carried those lessons for the rest of their lives. Even after prosperity returned, many continued saving leftovers, growing gardens, preserving vegetables, and avoiding waste. Children who watched their parents stretch a single potato into supper became adults who remembered every lesson. Some later described feeling uncomfortable throwing food away, even decades after the Depression had ended. The hardships had shaped them permanently. The recipes may have been simple, but the values behind them endured. Number 14. Potato bread stretcher. Bread was one of the most important foods in Depression-era households, yet flour was not always affordable. Potatoes offered a solution that bakers had known for generations. By mixing mashed potatoes into bread dough, families could use less flour while still producing large, satisfying loaves. The potatoes added moisture and softness, helping the bread stay fresh longer. A single loaf could feed a family for days, accompanying soups, stews, gravies, and nearly every other meal on the table. In many homes, potato bread became so popular that families continued baking it long after economic conditions improved. What began as a necessity evolved into a tradition. Sometimes the most enduring recipes are born not from abundance, but from adversity. The potato's greatest strength was never its flavor alone. Its greatest strength was its ability to become whatever people needed it to be. It could disappear into bread. It could thicken soup. It could create dumplings, patties, cakes, or casseroles. It could make small meals larger and difficult days slightly easier. And as we move closer to the top of our list, the ingenuity behind these meals becomes even more impressive. Number 13. Potato milk soup. On especially cold evenings, when the wind howled outside and frost crept across window panes, few meals offered more comfort than a pot of potato milk soup. It began with simple ingredients that many struggling households could sometimes obtain even during difficult times. Potatoes, milk, a little butter if available, and perhaps an onion for flavor. The potatoes were cooked until soft, then blended into the liquid, creating a creamy texture that felt far richer than the recipe actually was. For families who rarely tasted expensive foods, this soup carried an almost luxurious quality. A bowl of it warmed cold hands and filled empty stomachs. More importantly, it created the feeling that supper was something special, rather than another reminder of hardship. During the Depression, that feeling had tremendous value. People did not simply need calories, they needed hope. They needed moments that reminded them life would not always be difficult. A steaming bowl of potato milk soup often provided exactly that. Many memories from the Great Depression revolve around meals that today would seem astonishingly modest. Yet when elderly Americans later spoke about these dishes, they often described them with warmth rather than sadness. They remembered mothers stirring pots late into the evening, fathers returning home after unsuccessful searches for work. Brothers and sisters gathered around crowded tables. The food itself was rarely the most important part of the memory. What remained vivid was the sense of togetherness. Hardship stripped away many comforts, but it often strengthened family bonds. People learned to appreciate small blessings because there were so few of them. Number 12. Potato pancakes. Long before trendy restaurants rediscovered potato pancakes, they were helping struggling families survive. Grated potatoes mixed with flour created batter that could be fried into golden cakes, capable of feeding several people from very little food. The sound alone was memorable. As the batter touched the hot skillet, it hissed and crackled. Children often gathered nearby, watching eagerly as the pancakes browned. Served plain, they provided a filling meal. Served with applesauce, syrup, or preserves when available, they felt almost festive. Many immigrant communities brought their own versions of potato pancakes to America. And during the Depression, those traditions became especially valuable. Recipes that had helped previous generations endure poverty once again proved their worth. Families discovered that old knowledge often became most useful during new hardships. Number 11. Potato bean stew. If potatoes were one of the kings of Depression cooking, beans were certainly another. Both ingredients were inexpensive. Both stored well. Both stretched remarkably far. Together, they created one of the most practical meals of the era. A handful of dried beans could transform a small amount of potato into a hearty stew capable of feeding an entire household. The dish simmered slowly for hours, allowing flavors to blend and the broth to thicken. Sometimes bits of salt pork or bacon were added for seasoning. Often they were not. Either way, the result was nourishing, economical, and dependable. Dependability mattered enormously during uncertain times. Families could not control the economy. They could not control the weather. They could not control whether jobs would become available. But they could count on a pot of beans and potatoes to provide supper. As we reach the middle of our countdown, it is worth pausing for a moment to consider what these meals truly represented. Modern discussions of the Great Depression often focus on statistics, unemployment rates, bank failures, stock market crashes, and economic recovery. Those numbers are important, but they do not capture daily life. Daily life happened in kitchens. It happened around supper tables. It happened in moments when parents quietly worried about tomorrow while making sure their children felt secure today. Many mothers skipped portions of their own meals so others could eat more. Many fathers claimed they were not hungry when there was not enough food for everyone. These sacrifices rarely appeared in newspapers. They were acts of love performed behind closed doors. And every one of these recipes carries traces of those sacrifices. There is a story repeated in countless memoirs from people who lived through the Depression. Years later, long after prosperity returned, they would sit at a table covered with food and still feel the urge to save every crumb. Some wrapped leftovers so carefully that younger generations found it amusing. Others kept gardens despite no longer needing them. Many never forgot the lesson that food was precious, because there had once been a time when even a single potato mattered. Those habits became permanent reminders of years when survival depended on making every ingredient count. Number 10. Potato chowder. Reaching the top 10 brings us to one of the most beloved comfort foods of the era. Potato chowder transformed a few simple ingredients into something that felt hearty and substantial. Potatoes provided thickness. Milk added richness. Onions contributed flavor. Corn sometimes found its way into the pot when available. The result was a chowder capable of feeding large families while requiring very little money. Its popularity spread across rural communities, factory towns, and farming regions alike. A large kettle of chowder could remain on the stove throughout the evening, allowing family members to return for second helpings if there was enough. During difficult years, the ability to provide seconds was no small achievement. It created a sense of abundance in a world where abundance often seemed impossible. Number 9. Potato crust pie. Traditional pie crust required ingredients that struggling families sometimes lacked. Potatoes offered an ingenious alternative. Mashed potatoes could be pressed into pans to form a crust that held vegetables, gravy, leftover meat, or whatever filling happened to be available. This simple substitution stretched valuable flour supplies, while creating meals that felt more elaborate than their ingredients suggested. Families often looked forward to these pies because each one was slightly different. One week, it might contain cabbage and onions. The next week, it might feature beans or bits of leftover roast. The crust remained constant, while the filling changed according to circumstance. Once again, flexibility proved to be one of the defining characteristics of Depression cooking. As impressive as these dishes were, the most ingenious recipes are still ahead. The closer we move toward the top of the list, the more remarkable the creativity becomes. Some of the meals that follow manage to transform one potato into enough food for entire households, while creating dishes that many people would still happily eat today. Not because they had to, but because they genuinely enjoyed them. Number 8. Potato egg stretcher. During the Great Depression, eggs were valuable. For some families, they came from backyard chickens, but for many others, they were an ingredient that had to be used carefully. A single egg could not feed an entire family. Yet clever cooks discovered that when combined with potatoes, it could go much further than anyone expected. Grated or mashed potatoes were mixed with one egg and a small amount of flour, creating enough batter for a skillet full of cakes, fritters, or patties. What might have been breakfast for one person suddenly became a meal for several. Children often never realized how little egg had actually gone into the recipe. The potato carried most of the burden, adding bulk and texture, while the egg provided structure and richness. It was another example of a principle that appeared repeatedly throughout Depression cooking. Expensive ingredients were rarely used alone. Instead, they were stretched, diluted, and extended through careful combinations that maximized every penny spent at the grocery store. One of the most remarkable qualities of people who endured the Depression was their ability to find dignity in circumstances that offered very little comfort. Meals were rarely extravagant, yet families still took pride in preparing them well. Tables were set, food was shared. Parents did everything possible to preserve normal routines for their children. In many households, supper became a daily statement that hardship would not destroy family life. No matter how difficult the day had been, everyone gathered together when evening arrived. Number 7. Potato spoon bread. Somewhere between bread, pudding, and casserole sat a curious dish known as spoon bread. Depression-era versions often relied heavily on potatoes because potatoes could provide substance without requiring large amounts of flour. The finished dish emerged soft, warm, and comforting. It was eaten with a spoon rather than sliced like traditional bread, which is how it earned its name. For families struggling to make ends meet, spoon bread offered several advantages. It required few ingredients, fed many people, and paired well with nearly anything available in the kitchen. A bowl of beans became more filling alongside spoon bread. A small serving of gravy stretched further. Even a simple glass of milk felt more substantial when accompanied by a generous portion. In difficult times, versatility was every bit as valuable as flavor. Number 6. Potato dumpling supper. Earlier, we explored potato drop dumplings, but in many regions, larger dumplings became the centerpiece of an entire meal. Families prepared substantial potato dumplings and served them in bowls with broth, onions, or gravy. The dumplings themselves became the main course. Their size created the impression of abundance, something Depression-era cooks understood was psychologically important. A table covered with large portions felt reassuring even when ingredients were limited. Children often remembered these suppers fondly because the dumplings seemed enormous compared to the modest meals that usually appeared during hard times. The meal demonstrated another important lesson. Presentation mattered. People may have been poor, but they still wanted meals that felt satisfying. Creating that feeling required creativity rather than money. As years of hardship continued, communities developed networks of shared knowledge. Neighbors exchanged recipes the same way they exchanged seeds, tools, and advice. One woman might discover a new way to stretch potatoes and teach it to everyone on her street. Another might pass along a method for making bread with less flour. These exchanges became informal survival systems. The Great Depression tested individuals, but it also revealed the strength of communities. People who had very little often shared what they knew, because helping others increased everyone's chances of getting through difficult times. Number 5. Potato scrapple. Scrapple had existed long before the Depression, but the economic crisis encouraged families to adapt it in new ways. Traditionally made by stretching small amounts of meat with grain, Depression-era cooks often added potatoes to extend it even further. Leftover meat scraps that might otherwise feed only 1 or 2 people suddenly became enough for an entire family. The potatoes absorbed flavor while dramatically increasing volume. Once fried, the finished dish developed a crisp exterior and savory taste that made it feel far richer than its humble ingredients suggested. In a decade defined by scarcity, recipes like this allowed people to preserve the illusion of abundance. A tiny amount of meat could season an entire meal, rather than serving only a single plate. Number 4. Potato and salt pork dinner. Salt pork occupied an important place in many Depression kitchens because small amounts delivered enormous flavor. When paired with potatoes, it created a meal that appeared on countless American tables. The pork was often used sparingly, sometimes more as seasoning than as a true serving of meat. Potatoes absorbed the rich flavor during cooking, allowing families to enjoy the taste of meat without requiring much of it. This strategy appeared repeatedly throughout the decade. Meat was stretched, potatoes carried the meal. Every ingredient worked as efficiently as possible. The resulting dinners were simple, but they offered comfort during years when comfort was often in short supply. Now we arrive at the final moments of our countdown, where the ingenuity of Depression-era cooks reached its peak. These last 3 meals were not simply ways to stretch food. They were masterclasses in making almost nothing feel like enough. They represent the culmination of decades of practical knowledge, passed through generations and refined by necessity. Number 3. Potato Mulligan Stew. If any dish symbolizes Depression-era adaptability, it is Mulligan stew. There was no official recipe. There was no standard ingredient list. The stew became whatever circumstances allowed. Potatoes formed the base because they were affordable and filling. Beyond that, anything might be added: beans, onions, carrots, cabbage, leftover meat, or vegetables from a garden. Every pot told a different story. Railroad workers, laborers, unemployed families, and rural households all prepared their own versions. The beauty of Mulligan stew lay in its flexibility. It welcomed whatever ingredients happened to be available and transformed them into something nourishing. In many ways, it reflected the spirit of the Depression itself. People survived not because conditions were easy, but because they adapted constantly to changing circumstances. Number 2. Mock meat potato loaf. At first glance, it resembled a traditional meatloaf. Sliced and served at the table, it looked substantial and satisfying. Yet many versions contained very little meat, or none at all. Potatoes, breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings formed the bulk of the loaf. Small amounts of meat, if available, were stretched across the entire dish. Families appreciated it because it provided the appearance and experience of a hearty dinner without requiring expensive ingredients. Appearance mattered more than many people realize. A meal that looked plentiful helped maintain morale during difficult times. It reminded families that they could still create something special despite limited resources. And standing at number 1 is perhaps the most impressive example of all: the one-pot potato family supper. There was no single recipe because every family created its own version, but the concept remained remarkably consistent across America. One potato, sometimes only one, became the foundation of an entire meal. It was diced into tiny pieces, combined with onions, vegetables, scraps of meat, beans, dumplings, bread, or whatever happened to be available, then simmered together in a single pot. As the ingredients cooked, the potato released starch that thickened the broth and unified the entire dish. What began as a single potato gradually became a meal capable of feeding an entire household. It was not magic. It was ingenuity. It was the result of generations of experience, determination, and practical wisdom. More importantly, it represented something larger than food. It represented the refusal to surrender. When resources disappeared, people adapted. When money vanished, they found alternatives. When circumstances became overwhelming, they relied on creativity and perseverance. Today, Many of these meals have faded from everyday life. Supermarkets overflow with choices. Refrigerators are larger. Pantries are fuller. Yet the lessons behind these recipes remain surprisingly powerful. The men and women who created them understood something that transcends any economic era. Resilience is often built from small decisions repeated day after day. Saving a potato peeling, stretching a loaf of bread, sharing a bowl of soup, looking at a nearly empty pantry and finding a way forward anyway. These dishes were never really about potatoes. They were about people. People who endured uncertainty with courage. People who protected their families with ingenuity. People who transformed scarcity into survival. And perhaps that is why their stories still matter today. Long after the meals themselves have been forgotten, the determination that created them continues to inspire.